U.S. history, Lesson 40, the Ford-Carter Interlude and the origins in the beginning of the Reagan era. Gerald Ford, as President of the United States, is going to become the only unelected president in terms of having to serve out the remainder of Richard Nixon's term. Richard Nixon, for his part, resigned, as we had talked about in your previous lesson. His vice president had earlier resigned under charges of tax evasion, and a replacement had not yet been appointed. And so as such, there was no number two man to go to. Gerald Ford is going to then move into this slot. He's a member of the House of Representatives from Michigan at this point in time. A humble, self-effacing man. He famously said, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." And what he meant by that, to make the car analogy, what he meant by that was the nation did not need a great dynamic leader. What the nation needed was someone to help bring things together who could move the country forward. And that was what he saw as being his central goal. The very first thing that he did in this central goal, in some ways, guaranteed him to be a one-term president. Historians looking back now have determined, in the longer view as politicians, it was probably the right thing to do, but it guaranteed him enormous unpopularity, and that was the full and complete pardon that he gave to Richard Nixon, not right away, but very early in his term. The reason Ford did it was not out of any loyalty or love to Nixon. He argued, quite convincingly, it turned out over time, he argued that I had to get the nation past the Watergate thing, because the longer we kept looking backward, we never cut it loose. We'd never move forward from it. And it would just get uglier and uglier, and it would slow things down and divide things more and more. He said that he thought the best thing he could do would be to end it, because once I end it, it's over, it's done, and we can move forward. History is largely, and historians have largely seen that to be probably the correct or positive decision to make. Even though at the time there were people screaming for blood when it came to Nixon, that felt they'd been denied what we as a nation deserved in terms of justice not being done. Under Ford, in terms of the foreign policy ramifications of his being in office, there were numerous decisions that are going to come up under Jimmy Carter that we'll see moving away from American Truman Doctrine and containment activities. But before we get there, we have to look at the utter failure in Vietnam. In 1975, just 2 years after the Vietnam Accords, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam and goes in to essentially take them over and unify the country. The Ford administration, the United States in general, we've gotten out and decided we're going to stay out. We are not going to reinsert ourselves back into that, and it's the ultimate, in many ways, failure of American foreign policy in that region. Nixon, by getting us out with peace and with honor, it meant we weren't being chased out, but the conclusion was largely foregone after we left, particularly with the Nixon doctrine of we may give support, but it won't be military, that South Vietnam's days were numbered. On the economic front, Ford was confronted with the same problem that had confronted Nixon, that had started with Johnson and Kennedy, of an economy that had overheated, that now has been driven into major recession, or what's called stagflation. High unemployment, high prices, high energy costs, and low economic growth. Now, these high prices and this inflation is going to lead to a slowing of economic growth, and it's difficult to get credit, difficult to pay off loans, difficult to manage interest rates, and as such, automobile and building industries are going to be laying off all sorts of people. We're going to see the beginning now of the end of the golden age of the union labor movement, and labor is going to kind of roll back significantly. From here forward, organized labor will be losing both jobs and benefits in many ways. Taxpayers crushed under the burden in many ways, working and middle-class taxpayers crushed under the burden of local taxes and property taxes and federal taxes to pay for things like the big Great Society programs that carried out the New Deal and the massive defense budgets and the deficits that we now have, or now came out of these programs. We're going to lead to what were so-called taxpayer revolts that we'll get to soon enough. Taxpayers not wanting to pay more in local, state, or federal taxes, and a lot of then attraction to conservative principles and ideas which say that you don't necessarily need to pay for these things because maybe we need to return more money and decision-making to people with personal responsibility. This is part of personal choice. This will be part of the growth that we see in the conservative movement through the 70s, even through the interregnum presidency of Ford and then the Democratic presidency of Jimmy Carter. The backstory is there's a conservative groundswell that's building this country, a counter-reaction to the new left in the 60s and the counterculture and all the things that we had seen. Now, his pardon of Nixon in many ways is going to lead to, is going to seal Gerald Ford's political fate, even as the society's in transition. And so the Carter administration is going to come in and be handed these same issues to deal with. And in dealing with these issues, his one term in office that Carter is having is going to be filled with numerous difficulties, a lot of unpleasantness for him personally, and then one signature achievement. The difficulties are going to come from the fact that there's this economy with high inflation, high prices for goods, high interest rates, plus high energy rates, because there's an energy crisis. There's not the fuel embargoes that the Arabs have put in place that they've taken off. They're going to take them off, but charge high dollars for the petroleum. And the United States at this point in time was importing more petroleum than it was producing at home for its own internal consumption, which is a trend that we're going to see for most of the decades that follow. The fact that you have unemployment and high interest rates and economic uncertainty was going to make Carter's job difficult and make him somewhat unpopular. And he had an inability to get along with Congress to try to get his legislation passed, to get his agenda enacted. And he's going to make his infamous Malays Speech, which was never even called the Malays Speech. That's what critics call it, saying that Americans in many ways, we've questioned our own decision-making, questioned our own consequences, and we suffer from too much greed and consumption and selfishness, and we need to generate more effort towards working together. So it's sort of he wanted to view it as a president who spoke the truth to the people. What it was viewed at by the population was a president who was not going to lead us, but instead was going to lecture us on you need to be better as Americans. And the American voting public generally does not take to that too well. In terms of his foreign policy achievements and limitations, the one great achievement of his political career when it came to foreign policy came in the realm of diplomacy. It was the Camp David Accords, which he brokered the first peace treaty between Israel and any Arab nation, the Arab nation being Egypt, and was able to, through these accords, pursue what he called humanitarian diplomacy. I mean, in other words, almost going back to some of the Wilsonian ideas of a foreign policy based upon principle, not necessarily realpolitik. We'd seen that with containment and other things, but based on principles that were timeless American constitutional principles of human rights, human dignity, human worth, self-determination of peoples, and opportunities, the generating and fostering of opportunities for people to rise in the world, and non-persecution of individuals as well. Camp David Accords were part of this, as well as the Panama Canal Treaty of 1978. He brokers an agreement which turned the Panama Canal over to Panama at the end of 1999, the year 2000, and released it from American control, which was sort of an extension in many ways, you could say, of the long-running threat of the good neighbor policy. SALT II, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, in 1979, he is able to limit rocket launchers and controls the size of new missiles. And it was not passed by Congress, but he did negotiate with the Russians, and as Commander-in-Chief, Carter honored it anyway, even though it was never passed and approved by Congress. In so doing, he's trying to further the détente spirit of the 1970s with limited or mixed results at best. That ultimately will come to a halt with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. It seems like the détente is, we're back to the older Cold War model of communism on this worldwide march, and in retaliation for that, what Carter does as president is he orders the American U.S. Olympic team not to go compete and participate in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow that year. And we also not just boycotted the Olympics, but we put an embargo on grain shipments that we were sending to Russia as well. All this has the impact of making our relations with the Soviet Union rather frosty again. And it's seen as, this is the first time with the Olympics embargo that we see the Olympics transferred into an overtly political statement by a nation refusing to bring their athletes to it. So it had always been sort of political with the medal counts, but now it was being manipulated in a way that it was being used as a tool to make a political statement by an entire nation, at least an entire nation's governing administration. Ultimately, though, the downfall of the Carter administration is going to come from the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979. Because of American activities in Iran, which had gone back to the CIA overthrow of the legitimately elected government in 1953, we'd seen hostility towards the United States in the Middle East from some Islamic factions, Islamic societies. In 1979, there's a revolution, which overthrows the government the United States had installed in Iran some 30 years earlier. And with that overthrow, this new Islamic Republic is declared by Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini. And he insists on the return of the former leader, the Shah or King of Iran, return him to Iran in exchange for these hostages which he takes. He seizes the American embassy staff. Carter refuses to submit this kind of blackmail for terrorism purposes, and so for 444 days, these individuals were held by the Iranian government, and the United States largely is viewed as being somewhat impotent in a foreign policy sense as a result of this. And so in many ways, this policy does to Carter what the Nixon pardon did to Ford. His inability to make the United States seem like anything but what Nixon used to call this helpless, pitiful giant. That generated enough hostility of feeling towards him in the election cycle, plus the economic downturns that we've seen, the stagflation of the era, that's going to pave the way for what this undercurrent was we've been talking about, this conservative movement rising out of the ashes of 1964 and 1968 to rise to ascendancy. We're going to see this tidal wave of conservatism break in the 1980 revolution, which sweeps into power Ronald Reagan and large Republican conservative policies, which some might seem familiar to you if you've thought about the policies we've seen in the 20s and in earlier units in terms of minimal government regulation, etc. These are policies that we need to look at quite closely as now we shift to Ronald Reagan.